There's a generation that doesn't show up in most surveys. Born between 1954 and 1965, they're too young to be boomers, too old to be General X. They were promised the American dream as children, then watched it evaporate the moment they entered the workforce. And their financial behavior today makes absolutely no sense, unless you understand the psychological term coined specifically to describe them: Generation Jones. The generation that's still keeping up with expectations that no longer exist.
Let me explain what makes Generation Jones psychologically unique. The name comes from keeping up with the Joneses, and jonesing for something you can't have. Coined by cultural commentator Jonathan Pontel in the early 2000s, it describes approximately 53 million people born in that sweet spot between 1954 and 1965. They grew up watching Leave It to Beaver and The Brady Bunch. Their childhood was the peak of American optimism.
Moon landings. Expanding suburbs.
Fathers with single incomes buying houses and 2 cars. But here's where the psychology gets interesting. There's a concept in behavioral science called the expectation-reality gap. When the future you were promised doesn't match the future you get, it creates a specific kind of cognitive dissonance. You don't just feel disappointed, you feel cheated. And that feeling shapes your relationship with money for decades.
Generation Jones graduated high school and college into the worst economic period since the Great Depression,
the 1970s oil crisis, stagflation, interest rates hitting 20% by 1981. The reliable corporate ladder their parents climbed, it was being dismantled just as they reached for the first rung. Daniel Kahneman's research on loss aversion tells us that losses feel approximately twice as painful as equivalent gains feel good. Now imagine your entire generation experiencing a collective loss. Not of money you had, but of a future you were guaranteed. That's the psychological foundation of Generation Jones. They internalized middle-class expectations during childhood, then spent their entire adult lives chasing an economic reality that had already disappeared. Let's look at how this played out in real numbers. In 1973, when the oldest members of Generation Jones were just 19, the oil embargo hit. By 1979, inflation reached 13.3%. When they tried to buy their first homes in the early 1980s, mortgage rates peaked at 18.45% in October 1981. Compare that to their parents. A typical boomer born in 1946 could buy a median-priced home in 1970 for around $23,000. With a 7% mortgage rate and a median household income of $9,870, that home cost roughly 2.3 times their annual income. Now look at Generation Jones. By 1985, the median home price had risen to $75,500. Even with rates dropping to around 12% and median income at $27,735, that same home now costs 2.7 times annual income, but with double-digit interest rates making monthly payments crushing. Here's where their spending psychology gets fascinating. Research in consumer behavior identifies something called compensatory consumption. When people feel they've been denied status or security in one area, they compensate by spending in others.
Generation Jones couldn't afford the stability their parents had,
so they bought the symbols instead. They became the generation that pioneered the lifestyle concept in marketing. In the 1980s and 1990s, they drove the explosion in premium coffee, luxury cars on credit, designer labels, and destination vacations. Starbucks was founded in 1971, but it didn't become a cultural phenomenon until Generation Jones hit their 30s in the mid-1980s, when Howard Schultz transformed it from a coffee bean retailer into a lifestyle brand. They couldn't buy the 3-bedroom house their parents got at 25.
But they could buy the $4 latte that signaled they'd made it anyway. There's a term in social psychology that explains this perfectly.
Relative deprivation. It's the perception that you're worse off than people you compare yourself to, and it's one of the most powerful drivers of financial behavior ever documented. The concept was formalized by sociologist Samuel Stauffer during World War II. But it applies perfectly to Generation Jones. They weren't comparing themselves to their actual peers. They were comparing themselves to their parents at the same age.
And losing badly.
Studies on relative deprivation consistently show it produces more stress than absolute poverty. Someone living modestly but comfortably can feel more financial anxiety than someone with less if their reference group has more. Generation Jones had the unique misfortune of having the wealthiest, most secure generation in American history as their reference point. This created what economists call a permanent income hypothesis problem. Developed by Milton Friedman, this theory suggests people base their spending not on current income, but on expected lifetime earnings. Generation Jones expected to match their parents' trajectory.
House by 30. Paid off by 50. Comfortable retirement at 65.
So they spent as if that trajectory was still possible, even when the math clearly showed it wasn't. Between 1989 and 2001, the years when Generation Jones was in their peak earning years, household debt in America increased by $4.4 trillion. Credit card debt specifically more than doubled. They were trying to fund a 1960s lifestyle with 1990s wages and 2000s asset prices. The British economist Richard Easterlin studied this phenomenon extensively. He found that the economic conditions during your early adult years, roughly ages 18 to 25, shape your financial psychology for life. They become your baseline, your reference point, your definition of normal.
For Generation Jones, that baseline was economic chaos, and they've been financially compensating ever since. Some companies understood this psychology better than Generation Jones understood themselves.
Take the luxury car market. In 1983, Toyota launched Lexus specifically to capture buyers who wanted premium status but couldn't quite afford the traditional luxury brands their parents bought. The timing was perfect. The oldest members of Generation Jones were 29, prime car buying age. Lexus didn't sell cars, they sold attainability. Their entire marketing strategy was built on the phrase, the relentless pursuit of perfection. But the real message was simpler. You deserve what your parents had, and we'll finance it. By 1989, Lexus had sold 64,000 vehicles in its first year. Generation Jones was 62% of their customer base. The credit card industry ran a similar playbook. In 1986, Citibank launched the AdVantage credit card with American Airlines. It was the first major rewards program that turned everyday spending into aspirational experiences. The psychology was brilliant. You couldn't afford the life you expected? Charge it, and at least earn miles toward the vacation that proved you'd arrived. As Robert Cialdini documents in his book Influence, reciprocity is one of the most powerful persuasion techniques. The credit card companies gave Generation Jones rewards, and Generation Jones reciprocated by spending more and carrying balances longer than any previous generation. By 2010, Americans aged 45 to 54, the core of Generation Jones, carried an average credit card balance of $9.096, higher than any other age group. They were still funding the gap between expectations and reality. But perhaps the most successful exploitation came from the financial services industry. The shift from defined benefit pensions to 401k plans happened precisely when Generation Jones entered the workforce. The first 401k plan was created in 1978. By 1983, nearly half of large companies offered them. This transferred all investment risk from employers to employees, and Generation Jones, lacking the financial literacy or the defined pensions their parents enjoyed, were told they could invest their way to the retirement they deserved. Many didn't.
And many won't.
Here's what makes this story relevant today. Every younger generation now faces their own version of the Generation Jones problem. Millennials were promised that college degrees guaranteed career success, then graduated into the Great Recession. Gen Z was told that hustle culture and side gigs would bring financial freedom, then faced inflation not seen in 40 years. The psychological trap is identical. Expectations formed in youth, shattered by economic reality, leading to compensatory spending to maintain the illusion of progress. So what's the way out? First, recognize the reference point problem. As Morgan Housel explains in The Psychology of Money, your personal experiences with money make up maybe 0.000000001% of what's happened in the world, but maybe 80% of how you think the world works. Generation Jones thinks the world works like it did in 1965. It doesn't. And it won't again. The solution isn't to lower expectations, it's to change the comparison. Stop measuring against your parents' timeline. Stop measuring against the highlight reel on social media. Measure against your actual starting conditions and your actual progress. Second, break the symbolic spending trap.
That luxury car doesn't make you successful. It makes you leveraged. That designer bag doesn't signal status.
It signals you care what strangers think. Generation Jones spent 40 years buying symbols of a life they couldn't afford. Don't repeat it. Third, Understand that security comes from assets, not income. Generation Jones had higher incomes than their parents, adjusted for inflation. But their parents had pensions, affordable housing, and employer-paid healthcare.
Focus on building actual financial resilience. Emergency funds, paid-off debts, investments that compound. The boring stuff that doesn't photograph well but actually works. Remember that hook from the beginning? Generation Jones is still keeping up with expectations that no longer exist. Don't let that be your story. The most expensive thing you can buy is a life designed to impress people who aren't paying your bills.
If this changed how you think about money psychology across generations, subscribe for more behavioral finance breakdowns. Next, we're exploring why lottery winners and inheritance recipients almost always go broke. The psychology is darker than you think.